gosh, I always forget to push that button. Leah, are you still here?
I might have kicked her out.
I did.
No, it might have kicked her out.
Okay. I hope not. I won't kick her out. Oh, well, we've got this big quandary in our class just because like some students can come and some can come for like 1 hour and some can come for a different time. So I thought I'd sort of suggest an alternative, which to me sounds kind of cool. There's Leah. So the three of us will get to make the decision since we're the ones who are here. Leah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here we go. Tiana is here. Hi, Tiana. Leah, can you guys come on in here with your pictures? Because we're gonna figure out a good plan for ourselves if we can. So I'm going to bounce off to you what I'm thinking. So the challenge that I've had with this class is it's really pretty good class if we can engage, you know, and we can make it work online. We definitely can. But I thought that we have a weird situation where some people can come like for the second hour, some people can't come at all, some people can come for the first hour, but just sometimes, you know, it's like, it's just sort of a strange mix that we have here. And so I thought what might be kind of an interesting way to approach this would be that I would make these little videos on the main topics. Like, you know, those little practice quizzes I put up, but I kept taking them off because I didn't ever feel like I could teach the content to you. So if I did and recorded little videos that were like maybe 15 minutes long, and then I would assign you guys, or we would agree on a time for small groups. So about half of you, I would meet at, like, say if this is the time or whatever, the ones who want to meet, and the other half I'd meet for the other time. And we have this really focused time to like talk about your research ideas, which is really the biggest challenge in this course. And so instead of you coming and sitting here and me talking to you, you would watch those little mini videos, play around with those quizzes, see what questions you have, or find mistakes if I've made them. And then we come to class, we talk about those ideas, and then we get into your ideas for your proposal, which seems like rich discussion. So this is what I thought I might suggest. Like, I know Leah, for example, this would work better for you if we were coming an hour earlier. And if there were a few other students who could come at that time, then we could have a small group that comes an hour earlier. And I know Titania is one example, she can't come till 4. And so if we had another group on Thursdays that started at 4, then we could have like a Tuesday group that meets at 2 or whatever the time is, and a Thursday group that meets at 4, and everyone can have more time to interact. And so I wonder what you think about that. I'd like to hear from all of you, and this is just a plan for all of us. So if it doesn't sound like the right plan for you, you're not going to hurt my feelings or offend me or anything like that. So what are your thoughts on that
I honestly
proposal?
like that, like the whole Tuesday class at 2 and then Thursday at 4 or 3. I like that.
Yeah,
It'll work for me.
smaller group,
Yeah.
so more
smaller
time,
group.
and then we'd be more engaging instead of me
Yeah.
kind of lecturing more.
Mhm.
Matt, what do you think about that? You'd only come once a week, but you'd have to watch some of the lecture content.
I mean, that's fine. I can still do that.
What do you think?
I think the same thing. It's fine with me.
Does it work all right?
Yeah.
So even though we do the Tuesday one, will we still be able to come right like Thursday just to read?
Sure, you could come definitely if you wanted to. I mean, and we would be talking about research ideas and revisiting the content to make sure everyone understands it.
Yeah. I like that. That would be
Yeah.
nice.
Leah, how about you? What do you think about that?
I think that would be fine. I think that would work better for me. And coming in at, so it would be like I'm coming in Tuesday at 2.
We would have a group that would come Tuesday at 2 and a group that it might work better to come Thursday at 4, or you could come to both if you wanted, but
Okay,
I would be recording all of this stuff. Otherwise, I feel like I'm jumping around and I felt really like I've not been able to get this content to you very well this term. So I'm really feeling uncomfortable. So I hope to get a lot accomplished today. Tiana, Tanisha, I don't see your faces, but I think you're probably there. But do you have any thoughts on what I've just proposed? Which is meet with about half the class. We could even Tuesdays at 2 and meet with the other half Thursdays at 4.
I'm fine with that. That's fine with my schedule.
Okay, which would work better for you, Tanisha? Would a Thursday work or a Tuesday work? The-
Tuesday's fine.
Okay. Larger group on Tuesday. Tiana, how about you? Would you be able to make the Thursday group to be kind of with Titania? Tiana might not be quite able. Okay. Well,
Thursdays, I can try.
okay, all right, very good. Then we'd have a couple of people coming on Thursdays for sure, but you'd be more committed a little bit to it. And then we'd have, like half of you coming on Tuesdays, and anyone can come either day if they want to. But that way I feel like I could meet all of your needs a little better. And
Are
I
you
could,
gonna go through the same information on both days?
well, all of the required information is gonna be on the recordings. And then the questions that people had, those are where we would go, but ideally, we'd be talking about more how your thinking on your own proposal relates to this. Because these concepts are things you're gonna think about in your own proposal. Okay, so now I am guessing that probably the content that I recorded already, you haven't watched. So what my plan is today is to go over 3 key concepts for the first half of class. And then the second half of class, I want to introduce you to what's happening Thursday. And it's going to be Thursday at our regular time because the librarian is coming and this has been prearranged. And so I'm going to prepare you in the second half of our class today for what's happening Thursday, which is you're going to be starting your lit review. You're to get papers. And then she'll come for probably, I would imagine, an hour. Usually it's an hour, depending on your questions, hour and a half. But then the last part of the class, I'm going to give you instructions on an app that you can use for note-taking for your annotated bibliography. And that will eventually be useful for your paper. So I'll provide you with link to an optional app that might help you with all of that. So that would be this week, what we'd be doing. And so I hope that all makes sense. And so with that said, I'm going to move into sharing my screen and giving you sort of a basic idea of some content that I recorded in little videos, but I'm going to go over it with you anyhow. And then some content that I haven't yet recorded. So I'll share my screen. I love questions. And I'm just coming up on my share screen. Oh, geez. All right, so this is not for this class. Clear the canvas. All right, so this is an idea that I took a lot of time actually to make slides for, but now I'm going to present it to you this way because I think it's going to make it better. And I'm just going to plug in my extra screen and get so that your faces show online. All right, so key ideas that I want you to be familiar with as you're thinking about how to work with this quantitative experimental model. So one is the idea, I'm going to put 4 ideas. All right, so one is the idea of a theory, lowercase t, notice, and this is intentional. So this kind of theory is the way we use the word loosely. Like, have you ever heard someone say, maybe someone cuts them off on the road and they say, oh man, I have a theory about people who cut you off, you know, something like that. You just say it really casually, or like, my sons are always cranky after they play video games. I have a theory that it's something about these video games. So this is an informal theory. It's an observation you made. You're kind of joking. You're loosely saying, I have a theory about that. But you're just saying, you think you know why it happens, but you've not collected any evidence. You don't really know, but you just have an idea about that. So that's the informal theory. We're not going to be using that much, except, sorry, let's bring this back up. Because I just plugged in a second screen here. All right. Okay, that got lost. So theory. I've got to escape out of here because it seems to have frozen up when I plugged in my second screen. Won't even let me out of here. Okay. Try again. There we go. Our informal theory. So we're not going to use this much. Then from there, usually what we do after we have our informal theory and our topic is we find our research question. And we've already identified the main characteristics. You'll recall we have that acronym FINERS to determine if it's a good question. So is it feasible? Is it interesting and important? Is it novel? Is it ethical? Is it relevant? And is it specific? Okay. We ask our question, and then what we're going to do in the second half of our class, we review and read the literature. We review, read, research literature. We're going to talk about that in the second half of our class today. And then we tweak our question. I'll write that first. Adjust our question so that it fits what we've learned. And we hypothesize. And we can think about our hypotheses in a couple of ways. So first of all, a hypothesis is a specific prediction about the outcome of a study. For example, I told you I have that loose theory that my boys get cranky after video games. If I've thought of a study, I might hypothesize that boys who play video games for 1 hour will have higher scores on an irritability scale than boys who play board games for 1 hour. My theory has accomplished a number of things. First of all, I've identified my target population, boys. I could even specify 10-year-old boys or something like that. Like, there we go. So we have the boys. So our population. I've identified the conditions to which I'm going to expose these boys. They're either going to play video games for an hour or play board games for an hour. So I've introduced the manipulation. And I've introduced what I'm going to measure. And I'm going to give you some more terms for this in a minute. What I'm going to measure. So I'm going to be measuring their irritability. And finally, I've predicted a direction. Higher. These are going to be higher scores. So now I know what I'm going to measure, what I'm going to do, who I'm going to be measuring it on, and what direction I think the relationship will be. And so I'd say this is a decent hypothesis. It presumes that I have looked up the research on this and that this is a question that needs answering and so forth. But this is a good hypothesis. Now, when we are writing a hypothesis, this is what we call our research hypothesis. It means this is what we're predicting based on our logic. But when we come into statistics, which is what we're always doing in quantitative analysis, we need to think about our science. And so when we're thinking about statistical hypotheses, they look a little bit different. So a statistical hypothesis, we always assume that it's not true. Always assume that there's no effect. We start there because we don't ever want to bias our results. So if I have a new medicine and I think it's going to help with some condition, and I'm going to want to give people, I'm going to say, people who take my medicine will have less of this illness than people who take a placebo. My statistical hypothesis will say it's not going to matter. I'm going to assume that there's no difference. And that's for safety. And that hypothesis is called the null hypothesis. It's empty. Null means empty. And we always start there. So I'm going to put number 1. We start with the null hypothesis. And the abbreviation that you might see for null hypothesis is H for hypothesis, 0 for null, the empty hypothesis. And statistically, we just say the mean for group 1 will be no different than the mean for group 2, but it's just stating the research hypothesis if we write it in words. We would write Game Boys, just for the sake of our class, video game boys. Will have irritability levels. No different from board game boys. Okay. No different means that it's a null hypothesis, and we would write it, you might see it looking like this. This is a symbol for mean. The mean for group 1, which is the video game boys, will be equal to the mean for group 2, which is the board game boys. And then instead of stating our research hypothesis, we state what we call the alternate hypothesis. And this is actually what we hope will happen. I don't know what's going on here. Let me see if I can make it stop. No, why it's- no. I'll make it go away or why it's doing this. There we go. It's called the alternate hypothesis. And the alternate hypothesis is like our research hypothesis. But this is the way we state it in terms of statistics. We have our null hypothesis, HO, and our research hypothesis is H for hypothesis, A for alternate, ha. So we have ho and ha. And in this case, if we were going to write it in words, we'd write video game boys will have higher irritability than board game boys. And if we were going to put it into mathematical language, we would write the mean for group 1, which is video game boys, will be higher than the mean for group 2. I will not test you on that, but you should be familiar with it. If you had steps, you would already kind of know that language. So 2 kinds of hypotheses. We start with the empty hypothesis because we always want to assume that it's not going to be true. And then we seek for the whole time after that to reject it. So we start with the null hypothesis and then we try and get rid of it. We try to reject it. And so let's just draw a picture for you so you can see one way to think about this. So this represents a distribution of data. This is the x-axis. And on this x-axis, I'm going to put irritability. And let's imagine that this is on a scale that goes from 1 to 10. And that on average, if I give this scale to a whole bunch of boys, most of them are going to be kind of in the middle. They're not going to be perfectly serene, you know, which would be like this 1. And they're not going to be total cranks like it's going to be the 10. Some of them will be, but we're going to expect this normal distribution. So most of the boys, each of these representing boys, they're going to be in this main area. This is sort of like the precursor to our statistics. They're mostly going to be in here. And fewer are going to be down in the tails of this distribution that are really peaceful. And fewer are going to be in this cranky end of the disposition up here. And we know some rules of this distribution. We know that, I won't even go into all that. So what we're looking for in the statistical test, like the one I wrote, which is HA, our alternate hypothesis, the mean irritability for video game boys will be higher than the mean irritability for board game boys. So in other words, we're looking for our group of video game boys to have scores way up here on the high end of this distribution. That's what we're looking for. In fact, we want it to be so high that the probability, I'm going to write just a P for probability, of getting a group of boys with irritability scores this high is less than 5%. Let me say that again. We are looking for irritability scores in our group of video game boys that are so high that the probability of a randomly selected group of boys, I'll just put a random group of boys having irritability this high is less than 5%. This is the cutoff point we've chosen for what we're going to deem to be significant. And so if we do our test and our irritability scores for our group of boys who played video games is way up here in this tail of this distribution, then we say there's a statistically significant difference between the video game boys and the board game boys. But we don't ever say, oh, this is true. We don't ever say that. No. Because it's not true. We just have some evidence supporting it. And we also, when we're talking about statistics, we don't accept the alternate hypothesis. It's still just a hypothesis. But remember our null hypothesis. The mean for group 1, our video game boys, is equal to the mean for group 2. That's where we're starting. We're assuming that our group of boys is going to be somewhere in here, that there's going to be no difference. And so in the unlikely event that we get a score that falls way up into the tail of this distribution, in that case, we reject the null hypothesis. And so if we cross that off, we reject it. This is the only one that's left standing. And so this is a significant result. We reject the empty hypothesis or the null hypothesis. It still doesn't mean that it's true. This is one study, one sample. There's a 5% chance that we just happen to draw a random group of irritable boys and that it wasn't in fact the video games that made it. There's still that chance. There's a 5% chance. The probability is less than 5% of getting this group by chance, but there's still a chance. Okay. So let's take a pause here and see what you think about all this. This is the underpinnings of quantitative research. So let me get some thoughts from some of you. What do you think, Tanisha? Is that like a sensible sort of a thing? Should we look at another example?
Yes, we should.
Okay, let's look at another example. So we've been looking at studies of the bystander effect. You've all
Okay,
seen.
before you do, I have a question.
Thank you, yes.
Can you put the example back on screen?
Here it is.
So the null hypothesis means that there's going to be no difference.
Yes,
Okay, so no, I'm reading like a definition. So no difference in the hypotheses that you gave, which shows that the irritability is not going to affect their board game playing or their video game playing?
Everything you said is on, but I want to clarify one thing. So what you first said is, there's no difference and then you use that word, and the in would be irritability. There's no difference in irritability between these two groups of boys.
Oh, okay.
What you said that I wanted to clarify is you said their irritability won't affect their video game or board game play, but we're actually looking at the opposite direction. It's almost like my pen has a magnetic pull on my screen. We're actually looking at the opposite direction. We're looking at game type.
Okay.
Video game versus board. And the direction is this way. We're hypothesizing that it affects irritability. We're not hypothesizing that irritability affects play. No. This is the direction we're hypothesizing.
Okay.
And this is a linear relationship. There's one straight line from cause to effect. So we call it linear. And we're also hypothesizing causal, that the video game play causes the irritability. And so we'll be careful about the direction. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, let's use a study that you're familiar with then. You're familiar with the Good Samaritan study. Would anyone be able to state maybe what you think the hypothesis was of the Good Samaritan study? That's the one where they told these seminary students that they were either maybe going to be late for a talk if they didn't hurry, or they're going to be just on time, or they're going to be okay. They might have a few minutes to spare. So they told them that. And then they measured helpfulness, right? Could anyone state that in terms of a research hypothesis? It's a little hard. You have to be so careful with your words. Let's start with this. Let's start with students, seminary students. So we get our population. Who, what did they do to the seminary students? Who believed they were late. We could state it this way. Would have, I'm going to leave a blank here. Helpfulness. Than those who believed they had time to spare. We've addressed our population. Remember, we need to see that in a hypothesis. We've addressed our manipulation. Belief about time, or I might say sense of urgency. We can state it as we need to, but once we decide how to state it, we should stay with that. And we've stated what we're measuring. helpfulness. Another thing that needs to be stated is direction. So what are we hypothesizing about the direction of helpfulness? Seminary students who believe they were late would have higher, lower, more, less, what would we say? Helpfulness than those who believe they had time to spare. What could we say? What word would you fill in the blank?
Fair. More.
Would those students who thought they were late be more helpful, do you think the guess predicted? Or less helpful? That's the direction. What would we fill in that blank? I think we should choose more or less. Seminary students who believe they were late would have more helpfulness, would be more likely to help a stranger than those who believe they had time to spare. Or seminary students who believe they were late would have less helpfulness to a stranger than those who believe they had time to spare. So if they think they're late, they're more likely to help a stranger. What do you think? More or less?
Less.
Less. So that's our direction. So now let's continue and look at this in terms of the statistical hypotheses. I'll change to blue here. Statistical hypotheses. First of all, we make the null hypothesis. Could anyone take this research hypothesis and restate it as a null hypothesis? An empty hypothesis that states no difference? I'm going to shorten it down. I'm just going to write late students will not differ in helpfulness from non-late students. Here's our statement that it's null, will not differ, meaning no difference. And if we were going to write it in shorthand, we would use our whole H for hypothesis, 0 for null, and we would write, this symbol means mean, helpfulness. For late students, group 1, I'll put a 1 here. Oh, it keeps sneaking away from me like that. Here's our 1. Here's our late students. I'll put a group 1. Here's our non-late students. This will be group 2. So the mean helpfulness for group 1 will be equal to the mean helpfulness for group 2. Our research hypothesis, or our alternate hypothesis, we could write group 1, late students, and in parentheses, I'll write group 1 would have lower helpfulness than non-late students. Group 2. And if we're going to write this in our alternate hypothesis, and if we're going to write it in shorthand, we write our HA, H-A, put a colon, and write the mean helpfulness levels for group 1, our late students, would be lower than mean helpfulness levels for group 2. Let's draw this out. If we have a distribution of helpfulness that looks like this, I'm giving you a simple version of what happens statistically. It's all you really need. You can see here that we actually have 2 groups, and so the model would be a little different, but this is the idea that you can stay with and that I'm going to show you. You don't need more than this until you get to your stats class. Let's say helpfulness is measured on a scale of 1 to 10. Most people fall into the average range of helpfulness, like this. Our null hypothesis, if our null hypothesis states that, yeah, you know, this group is going to fall somewhere in here. So I'm going to write in blue a dot suggesting that this is our null hypothesis. That means that the helpfulness of these students who thought they were late, it's just right in the middle there. It's no different from what we would expect. But if our group gets a helpfulness score that falls into this yellow area here, this is our research hypothesis. Mean 1 is lower than mean 2. If that happened, let me just write this out. If that happens, if our score is here where the green is, then we reject the null hypothesis. We reject it. We cross it off, we scribble it out, we reject it. We're done with it. And the only thing that's left is our research hypothesis. And so if that happened, we would say first that this is statistically significant. Likely before we did our study, we're going to do, which is something you're going to do in this course, you're going to decide how significant do you want to have this result? How rigorous do you want it to be? Usually we set the probability at 0.05 in social sciences. And so we might say P probability is less than 0.05. There's less than a 5% chance of achieving this just at random. And to say that again, we would write the probability of helpfulness scores that low could, is less than 5%, is less than 5%. And the final caveat is we would never say Therefore, it's true that being late causes people to be less helpful. We would never say it. Let's put a big red X through that. Because in science, we aren't really finding about truth. I mean, that's our ultimate goal. But to be very precise, we can only find evidence for or evidence not supporting a hypothesis. So instead of saying true, we don't say our hypothesis is true. We say evidence, let me write in a different color here. We would instead write evidence from this study supports the hypothesis. So let's think of what questions you might have right here. Anybody? Tanisha, is that example helping you to feel more clear?
Yeah, that was helpful.
That was helpful. Okay, good, good. So, Chaz, how about you?
I think I'm getting there to understanding it. I probably have to do on my own another example to, make sure that I got it right.
Yeah, stating hypotheses is kind of hard. You get in the habit of it a little bit. So this idea, you might be wondering, why do we do it this way? Why do we start with this null hypothesis, which seems so useless? And I'm going to give you a little bit of a parallel way to think about it. And think about people who might be arrested for something. Now this may not always play out, but we have an idea in our legal system, innocent until proven guilty. We're going to revisit this again at another time when we talk about error types, but what does this mean in terms of the legal system? Like if someone's innocent until they're proven guilty, what does it mean? Or why is this an important precept?
Because a lot of people judge before they go in front of, a judicial system. Innocent until proven guilty means that it has to be a system that's going to prove it before, you just judge them on your own.
Yeah. In a way, we're saying, and we're going to revisit this concept, but we're saying it would be better to have a person who committed a crime go free than to have someone who didn't commit a crime get imprisoned. That's kind of what our legal system is intending to say. It's an imperfect system, but this underlies it, right? It would be worse to put someone in jail that shouldn't be there than it would be to let someone who should be in jail go free. That's the tenet, okay? So in a way, this relates to this idea of the null hypothesis. If we said this in terms of a prisoner, we're assuming no guilt. The assumption is HO. No guilt. And the only way to accept HA is to reject HO. We have so much evidence that we have to reject the idea that there's no guilt, right? But we want to start with assuming that there's no guilt. And that's the same thing in science. We want to start not with a bias. We want to start assuming there's nothing going on. So we'll revisit this a little bit later, but I wanted to just bring that idea forward. Okay, I'm going to take about a little bit of time to just talk to you. Now I have a separate lecture on this. I won't pull up the slides. Actually, I am going to pull them up quickly to show you something in them. What I've offered to you in terms of how to create these little lectures that I wanted to share with you is that there are some basic, what are called seminal studies that you should familiarize yourself with. These are really famous studies that developed into big theories. And these seminal studies are in both of these slides that I've recorded for you, but I can't put the videos up because it's against the law, it violates copyright. So if you look at the slides themselves, I'm just going to go forward. You'll see the seminal studies that I'm saying to you. A class divided, there's a video link. The Asch conformity study is a seminal study, there's a video link. This one's real short, 5 minutes. And here's the video on a slide, the Bobo doll experiment. And there's a video link. The car crash study, and there's a video link, and then the Good Samaritan study, and you've already seen the video link. So I want you to familiarize yourself with these seminal studies because we'll talk about them often because they give us nice examples for our content. But in the meantime, so for example, this is the content that I've made a little lecture of, and I have put the slides up for you. And so you can look at that lecture separately. So since you're going to be able to introduce you to this topic another way here in this classroom. So we've been talking about 2 studies here. The first study that we talked about is my little hypothesis about boys who play video games, and that's not a real study, that's like a proposal. So we've talked about video games and irritability in boys. Okay. And we looked at our hypothesis about video game boys will have higher irritability, is my prediction. Irritability. And board game boys. Right, so that was our hypothesis. I'll write this as our alternative hypothesis. All right, so we have some names for the things that we pointed out. One of the first things I pointed out is that we have the presumption of the manipulation. And so in this case, the researchers are going to bring all these boys in and either assign them to play video games for an hour or to play board games for an hour. Okay? That's what's being done. That's the manipulation. And we call it, the term for it that you need to know, let me see what color I can use, is the independent variable. And the common abbreviation for it is IV. And the independent variable is the variable that is manipulated by the researcher. And so in this case, the independent variable, so I'll go back to my black pen. In this study, the independent variable is game, all right, IV, game type, and then I'm going to put a colon and write board, board versus video. And so this is what's manipulated by the researcher. It's randomly assigned, these boys are randomly assigned to this type of game. Okay, so it's independent of anything else in the boys. And then I also pointed out that we knew what we were measuring. We were going to measure irritability. Some number is going to be attached to irritability. And so let's write down a definition for what we call, there's the independent variable, the dependent variable. Or the DV.
Dr. Russ, this is Leah. I have to sign off.
Okay. I'll put a pause on the recording when we start our lit review section, and you can watch that later, okay? And thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you.
And to Tanya, those of you who came in, I'll catch you up on what we discussed at the start of class. We'll talk about it again at the end of class. All right, the dependent variable, or DV, is the variable that on the IV, or what is being measured. So this can be a complex concept until you've gotten really comfortable with it, so you might have to play with this a while. But in this case, another way you can think about it is you're thinking that the IV causes DV. So in this case, the researcher hypothesizes that game type causes irritability. So that's another way to think about it. So that's the independent and dependent variable. And then if you look in this slides that I've created, you can see some really simple examples. And on your own time, you can watch the entire show, but you can see here, the independent variable is what is changed or manipulated by the researcher. In this case, they're trying to see if the amount of water, that's the independent variable, causes differences in the size of the plant, the number of leaves, or whether the plant lives. They're not predicting that the size of the plant causes differences in water. So this is the direction of the relationship between the IV and DV. You can tell, you might be saying, yeah, but they're going to measure the amount of water, right? And you'd be right about that, but that's what they're controlling. They're manipulating that, so they're deciding that in advance, but this is the question they have. This is what they're measuring to see if it's impacted. In this example, the researchers think that some type of medicine will cause some sort of health outcome. And so the independent variable is what the researchers decided on, that is to give one group the real medicine and one group the sugar pill. And the dependent variable is health. So you might need to work with these concepts a little bit. So let's just put one together. But actually, let's look at the quiz and do a couple of those, and then we'll step into our next work. So there's a little practice quiz here. Do a few of them together. And here's the lectures that I put. All right, you guys ready? I'll make it a little bigger. Oh, shoot. No, there's two concepts in here that I haven't introduced you to yet, and that I've decided intentionally not to introduce you to, so I'm gonna just take this away for right now, okay? But I'm gonna give you some other examples. So I'm gonna write a hypothesis, and then I'm gonna see if you can determine what is the independent variable. Okay, ready? Here we go. Here comes the hypothesis. Okay. People, let's start with older people with bird feeders outside their window have higher levels of well-being than older people without bird feeders. Okay. So let's start by figuring out what is being manipulated. So this suggests an experiment. I think we did this one exactly. Maybe we did this one in here. I can't remember. So, but let's look at it this way. So what is the researcher thinking about manipulating here? Okay, good. So what would that be? The independent variable or the dependent variable?
Independent.
Independent, very good, Cody, yes. The independent variable, or IV, is, let's just put bird feeders. Present versus absent. So now what would the dependent variable be, or what does the researcher think would depend on whether they have a bird feeder?
Well-being.
Very good. Well-being. This is what the researcher is going to measure. In some way, that's what the number is going to be attached to. And the researcher will compare those two groups. Another example. All right, how about thinking of a pivotal study here? Teachers who believe a child comes from a wealthy family will give higher grades to ambiguous performance than teachers who believe the same child comes from a poor family. This is a famous study by Darley, the same one who did the bystander effect. They're saying if the teacher believes the child comes from a rich family, this is what they did. And they had this child take this test where she just gave the answers out loud. And, you know, so the test, and there was an ambiguous performance. You could rate it as good or bad. And then they looked at, they told teachers different things about the background of the child and looked to see whether there were any differences in the way they graded that performance. So what do you think is manipulated here? Tanish, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say the different families.
Okay, very good. Can we state that in terms of a variable? like, how would you state it so that we have the name of the variable and then condition 1 versus condition 2?
For the wealthy and the poor.
Okay, wealthy versus poor. So what's the name of the variable then?
Child.
What?
Child or children.
Yeah, or maybe belief, right? Because that's the teacher's belief about the child, not the child itself. And then wealthy versus poor. Those are the conditions. And then the dependent variable, what's being measured that they think will depend on this belief? Grade. Yeah, the grade. The grade given to an ambiguous performance, but saying it the way you stated it is just fine too. Right, so this was a way of looking at some sort of a subtle discrimination. They found this, in fact, to be, the hypothesis was supported. So that's just a key concept that you'll be working with as you design your study. Questions about this idea? Titania and Tanisha joining us from this remote, that's kind of hard. I think we lost Chas. Okay, then let's jump into prepping for our next class. And I'll stop the recording and restart it at this point. So on Thursday, Ms. Rhiannon Sorrell is going to come to class, and hopefully we'll get enough students. And she's going to spend like an hour and a half teaching you guys about the library. And you may, as I would have had in younger times, be thinking of the library as mostly books. But for our class, you're not going to be using books. You're going to be using journal articles instead. And most of the articles you get are going to be PDF documents, just like you've seen in our class so far. And you're going to have to read them. And I remember when I was a young student, the first time I had to read research papers, I was appalled. I thought, oh, these people don't even know how to write. Like, I didn't understand anything. And I remember finding it really annoying that, let me show you some of these articles, that, I'll show you something that really annoyed me when I was young that I did not understand. And it is, so this is an article we're going to work with today as we talk about this next content. But let me show you what we see when we start reading the article. Look at this. All of these interruptions of fluent reading. Sexual violence is a widespread community problem. Interruption. Indeed, a recent population-based survey found that 58.5% of women and 19.1% of men report being raped, sexually coerced, or experiencing unwanted sexual contact in their lifetime. That's the second sentence. And look, an interruption. Moreover, 20 to 25% of college women report experiencing an attempted or completed rape during college alone. Here, right in the middle of a sentence, we have an interruption.